The Galactic Senate Chamber stretched across 17 kilometers of crystalline architecture, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into a perpetual twilight of bioluminescent gases. 1,700 species gathered in their designated alcoves, their translators humming with anticipation as Supreme Arbiter Vorthanex of the Collective Dominion approached the central speaking platform. His 4-meter frame moved with the practiced grace of a species that had ruled the Orion Arm for 12,000 years. The Vorkith were ancient when most sentient species were still crawling from their primordial seas, and they never let anyone forget it. Ambassador Lyrian Chen stood in humanity's modest alcove, her diplomatic uniform crisp despite 3 days without sleep. Beside her, Admiral Marcus Webb watched the proceedings through narrowed eyes, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a pose that had become permanent over decades of service. "They're going to do it," Webb muttered. 12 years of negotiations, and they're actually going to do it." Chen didn't respond. She knew. They all knew. The vote had been tallied the previous cycle, and the numbers were insurmountable. The Collective Dominion had finally convinced enough species that humanity was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too volatile to be permitted further expansion. The Vorkith had spent centuries building their coalition. First, they'd banned human access to hyperspace lanes. Then, trade restrictions. Then, territorial constraints that pushed humanity's 12-colony worlds into an ever-shrinking sphere. And now, after humanity had dared to reverse engineer collective technology, after they dared to build their own jump drives without permission, the final solution had been proposed. Vorthanex's voice resonated through the chamber like distant thunder. The Galactic Senate has reached its decision regarding the human question. The translation algorithms rendered his words in perfect standard English, but they couldn't capture the contempt woven through every syllable. The Terran conglomerate has proven itself incapable of compliance with galactic law. Their unauthorized development of dimensional fold technology represents an existential threat to the stability of our civilization. Their aggressive expansion, their military buildup, their refusal to submit to designated oversight, all of this demonstrates a species fundamentally incompatible with the peaceful order we have maintained for millennia. Chen felt her jaw tighten. Aggressive expansion. They'd colonized 12 worlds in 50 years, worlds that nobody else wanted, on the fringes of explored space. The Vorkith had claimed 8,000 systems in that same time frame. Therefore, Vorthanex continued, by a vote of 1,243 to 451, with 6 abstentions, the Galactic Senate has authorized the Extinction Protocol for the human species. The chamber erupted. Some species cheered. Others sat in stunned silence. In the distant alcove designated for the Kethrani Federation, one of the few species that had voted against the resolution, Ambassador Zelvith lowered her sensory fronds in what passed for brief among her people. Chen stood motionless, her training the only thing keeping her upright. Admiral Webb's hand found her shoulder. "Ambassador, we need to leave, now." "The protocol will be executed in 60 standard rotations," Vorthanex continued over the chaos. "All human colonies will be neutralized simultaneously. The Terran homeworld will be rendered uninhabitable. The human species will be catalogued and preserved in genetic archive, as is custom, but their active presence in this galaxy will be terminated." Chen finally found her voice. "They can't. The treaty of—" "The treaty is null," Webb interrupted. "They just voided it." "Ambassador, we have 60 days to get home, and I have a feeling our diplomatic shuttle isn't going to be given priority lane access." They moved toward the chamber's exit, but a wall of armored bodies blocked their path. The collective's security forces, massive, augmented creatures from a dozen species, had formed a perimeter around the human delegation. Vorthanex's voice cut through the noise. "The human ambassadors will remain as guests of the collective until the protocol is complete. We cannot permit them to warn their homeworld and potentially complicate the cleansing." Chen spun to face the speaking platform. "This is a violation of diplomatic immunity. Under the Galactic Charter—" "The Galactic Charter applies to recognized species," Vorthanex replied calmly. "Humanity's recognition is being revoked. You have no rights under our law. You never truly did." The gods closed in. Admiral Webb's hand moved toward his sidearm, a ceremonial weapon, barely functional, but a symbol nonetheless. "Don't," Chen whispered. "They want an excuse." Webb's hand stilled. He was military through and through, but he wasn't stupid. Drawing on 12 armed guards would only give the collective footage of human aggression to justify their genocide. As they were escorted from the chamber, Chen caught one last glimpse of the Senate floor. Most species had already returned to their conversations, their negotiations, their mundane concerns. Humanity's extinction was just another agenda item, already processed and forgotten. But in the Kethrani alcove, Ambassador Zelvith was watching, and though Chen couldn't read alien expressions, she could have sworn she saw something like hope in those ancient eyes. Part 2. The Long Silence. High Executor Thalvex stood on the observation deck of the Voidhammer, watching Sol grow larger in the forward displays. The human star, a yellow dwarf of unremarkable composition, burned with peaceful indifference to the armada that had come to end its children. "Curious," his tactical adjutant observed. "They haven't deployed any vessels." Thalvex's crest fluttered with what might have been amusement. "Did you expect them to? Our fleet numbers 47,000 vessels. Their entire navy, by our last intelligence reports, consists of perhaps 800 ships, most of them sub-capital class. Still, I expected some resistance. The humans are known for their stubbornness. A trait that has served them poorly. If they had simply submitted to collective oversight, accepted their designated role, none of this would be necessary." Thalvex clasped his lower hands behind his back. "Status of the colony strikes. All 11 secondary targets report successful sterilization. The colonial populations have been eliminated. 11 worlds. 4 billion humans, gone in the span of a single rotation. The collective's fleets had struck simultaneously, as planned, before any warning could spread. The colony's minimal defenses had been overwhelmed in minutes. Only Earth remained. "And the dimensional fold inhibitors?" Thalvex asked. "Active across the entire system. Nothing larger than a personal shuttle can open a fold within 15 light hours of Sol. If they had any ships hidden elsewhere, they cannot reach us." Thalvex nodded. The humans had somehow developed their own version of dimensional fold technology, primitive compared to the collectives, but functional. It was this transgression, more than any other, that had sealed their fate. The Vorkith could not permit any species to possess independent FTL capability. Control of movement meant control of everything. "Bring us to optimal bombardment range," he commanded. "Deploy the planet crackers to targeting positions. I want this finished before the next cycle." The fleet spread across the void like a metal plague. 47,000 ships of every size and configuration, carrying enough firepower to shatter a dozen worlds. The Void Hammer itself was a dreadnought of the highest class, 3 kilometers of weapons and armor, the personal flagship of the High Executor. As they approached Earth, Falvex studied the blue-green world with clinical detachment. It was a beautiful planet, he supposed, if one appreciated such things. Abundant water, diverse ecosystems, optimal temperature for carbon-based life. What a waste that such a world had spawned such troublesome creatures. High Executor, his communications officer, interrupted. We're receiving a transmission from the human homeworld. It appears to be a broadcast to the entire fleet. Audio only? Visual as well. They're using a standard diplomatic frequency. Thalvex's crest rippled with annoyance. They wish to beg for mercy at the final moment? Very well. Let them speak. It changes nothing, but I would hear their last words. Display it. The forward screen flickered, and a human face appeared. A female, by their species' dimorphic indicators, with close-cropped gray hair and sharp features. She wore what appeared to be a military uniform, adorned with more medals than Thalvex could easily count. This is Admiral Victoria Okonkwo, Supreme Commander of the Terran Defense Initiative, the human said. Her voice was calm, remarkably so, given that 47,000 warships were positioned to reduce her world to rubble. I am addressing the collective armada now entering Terran space. We're listening, Thalvex replied, though he doubted the transmission was two-way. Offer your surrender. But Admiral Okonkwo wasn't finished. 12 years ago, when the collective first imposed sanctions on human commerce, we saw the writing on the wall. When you banned our ships from hyperspace lanes, we knew what was coming. When you constrained our territorial expansion and demanded we surrender our defensive capabilities, we understood. She paused, and something in her expression made Thalvex's crest stiffen with unconscious unease. You were never going to let us survive. Not truly. Oh, you might have kept us contained, caged, slowly diminishing over centuries until we faded into extinction without the need for violence. But we were always going to die. That was the plan from the beginning, wasn't it? Humans, too aggressive, too creative, too dangerous to be permitted a future. Thalvex found himself leaning forward. There was something wrong with this transmission. Some quality he couldn't identify. So we prepared, Okonkwo continued, quietly, carefully. While your ambassadors smiled and offered compromise, while your spies watched our shipyards and counted our vessels, while your diplomats convinced the galaxy that we were the threat, we prepared. The adjutant's voice cut in, pitched high with alarm. High Executor, dimensional readings are spiking. Something is... The void tore open. Not in one place, but in 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Rips in reality cascaded across the star system like lightning fracturing a dark sky, each one vomiting forth vessels that hadn't existed in any intelligence report, hadn't been built in any shipyard the collective monitored, hadn't been imagined in any strategic projection. Thalvex watched in frozen horror as the stars themselves seemed to multiply. What? He breathed. You've studied us. Okonkwo's voice continued from the screen, cold and hard as vacuum itself. You've cataloged our tendencies, our psychology, our supposed weaknesses. You thought you understood humans. You thought you knew what we were capable of. Ships emerged from the dimensional tiers. Not hundreds, Not thousands. Millions. They poured from the wounds in space like blood from a severed artery, spreading across the system in formations that dwarfed the collective armada the way a sun dwarfs a candle. Capital ships the size of small moons, carrier vessels that disgorged swarms of attack craft like mechanical locusts, weapons platforms bristling with armaments that defied classification. You were wrong. Part 3. The Void's Children. Thalvex couldn't process what his sensors were showing him. His tactical displays had devolved into chaos, the tracking systems overwhelmed by the sheer number of contacts now flooding the system. "Report," he screamed at his adjutant. "What are we seeing?" I don't." The adjutant's manipulators flew across his console, but his voice carried the tremor of barely contained panic. "High Executor, I'm reading over 2 million distinct vessel signatures. They're still emerging. The dimensional tears aren't closing." 2 million? That's impossible. Where did they come from? How did they generate folds inside our inhibitor field? They didn't generate them from inside the field, sir. They're coming from outside normal space entirely. These readings, they don't match any known dimensional transit signature. It's like they were already here, just somewhere else, somewhere our sensors couldn't reach. The human admiral was still speaking, her image unwavering despite the pandemonium erupting across the collective fleet. 12 years ago, we discovered something in the deep void between stars, something the collective had missed, or perhaps something you'd found and chosen to forget. A dimension outside your charts, beyond your fold lanes and inhibitor ranges. A place where space itself moves differently, where time is negotiable, where a fleet can be built in secret and multiplied across centuries while only months pass in the universe you know. Thalvex's blood ran cold. The deep void. The dimension the collective scientists had theorized about millennia ago, only to abandon the research when early expeditions never returned. A theoretical space between spaces, where the laws of physics operated on different principles. "You're lying," he whispered, though he knew she wasn't. No species could survive there. The dimensional pressure alone would... "Would what?" Okonkwo interrupted, as if she could hear him. Perhaps she could. Perhaps the transmission was two-way after all. Would require a species stubborn enough to adapt, desperate enough to try, willing to sacrifice and struggle and evolve if that's what survival demanded? On the tactical display, the emerging fleet had finished its transition. The dimensional tiers sealed, leaving behind an armada so vast that it blocked out the stars. "We call ourselves the Void Children now," Okonkwo said. "Those of us who went into the deep, who built and bred and prepared while you smugly plotted our extinction. We spent 300 years in there, High Executor. 300 years your time, while only 12 passed for your Senate and your sanctions. 300 years of building, of preparing." Thalvex's adjutant spoke again, his voice dead and hollow. "High Executor, I'm getting readings on the fleet's flagship. It's registering at 47 kilometers in length. That's larger than any mobile station in the collective. I didn't think that was possible." "It wasn't," Thalvex said. "Not in normal space. But in the deep void, where the dimensional pressure could support larger mass configurations." He understood now. He understood everything. The humans hadn't just hidden a fleet. They'd found a dimension where they could build ships of unprecedented scale, where they could establish colony after colony without collective interference, where generations could rise and fall, developing technologies beyond anything the galaxy had seen, all while the rest of the universe thought they were still those same limited, constrained creatures occupying 12 marginal worlds. "You only ever saw the surface of us," Okonkwo said. "The face we chose to show you. The Earth and the colonies were never our home world, High Executor. They were the bait, the decoy, the acceptable losses we knew you'd eventually claim. The real humanity, the Void Children, we've been waiting for this day since before you were born." Thalvex's hands trembled. Acceptable losses. 4 billion humans on Earth and the colonies. They'd written off 4 billion of their own people just to maintain the deception. What kind of species could do that? The kind, he realized with dawning terror, that would survive anything. Part 4. The Reckoning. The first salvos of the Void Fleet struck the collective armada before Thalvex could even begin to formulate a response. Weapons that shouldn't exist, that violated every principle of known physics, lanced across the void and turned collective vessels into expanding clouds of superheated gas. The Void Hammer shuddered as something struck its shields. Energy readings spiked beyond measurable parameters, and 3 decks on the port side simply ceased to exist. "Damage report," Thalvex roared, gripping his command throne as the deck heaved beneath him. "Hull breach on decks 15 through 17. Shield generators are—" The adjutant never finished his sentence. A beam of coherent darkness, there was no other way to describe it, punched through the bridge viewport and erased him from existence. Thalvex threw himself behind his throne as the bridge erupted into chaos. Emergency force fields engaged, sealing the breach, but half his command staff were already dead. The others scrambled for weapons or emergency stations, their training overriding their terror. Outside, the collective fleet was dying. Thalvex crawled to a functioning display and watched his armada, the pride of Vorkith military might, crumble like ash before a hurricane. Ships that had conquered 100 worlds were swatted aside by Void Fleet weapons. Carriers that had subjugated entire species detonated under concentrated fire from attack craft small enough to slip between point defense arrays. And the humans, these new humans, these Void Children, fought with a precision and coordination that bordered on telepathic. Every vessel knew exactly where every other vessel was. Every attack anticipated every possible response. It wasn't just superior technology, it was superior integration, as if the entire fleet were a single organism with 2 million components. "Fleet Command, respond!" Thalvex shouted into his communicator. "All vessels, initiate emergency fold! Retreat to—" "Retreat where?" The voice came from behind him. He spun, reaching for a sidearm that had been knocked loose in the attack. A human stood on the bridge. Male, tall, wearing armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. He'd materialized from nowhere. Teleportation, Thalvex's tactical mind noted. Personal range dimensional translation, another technology that shouldn't exist. "You can't fold out," the human continued, stepping over the bodies of Vorketh officers without a glance. "Our inhibitors are better than yours, stronger, more comprehensive. Your fleet isn't going anywhere." Thalvex found his voice. "You would slaughter 47,000 vessels? This is genocide!" The human stopped walking. Something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not hatred, but something colder. Something infinitely tired. "Genocide," he repeated. "That's an interesting word for you to use, High Executor. Tell me, what would you call the systematic extinction of an entire species? What would you call the sterilization of 11 worlds and 4 billion people? What would you call the planned murder of every man, woman, and child on Earth?" Thalvex opened his mouth, But no words came. "For 300 years we've watched you," the human said. "From the deep void, we could observe normal space, see everything you did while you remained blind to us. We watched you plot our extinction. We watched you convince the Senate that we were too dangerous to live. We watched you laugh about how easy it would be to erase us from history." The ship shuddered again. More collective vessels dying. Thalvex could feel the armada crumbling through the tactical link he still maintained with the fleet's command network. "So yes," the human concluded, "this is genocide. We learned it from you." Thalvex lunged for the fallen sidearm. He never reached it. Part 5. The Message. Admiral Victoria Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Prometheus Unbound, the 47-kilometer flagship of the Void Fleet, and watched the last collective vessels burn. "Final count?" she asked. 46,892 enemy vessels destroyed, her tactical officer reported. 112 disabled and captured. We've secured High Executor Thalvex and 1,800 ranking officers for processing. Our losses? 17 vessels destroyed, 43 damaged, 8,419 casualties. Okonkwo closed her eyes. 8,000 lives, a fraction of what the collective had claimed today, but each one felt like a personal failure. 3 centuries of preparation, the most advanced fleet ever constructed, and she still couldn't protect everyone. That was the burden of command. It never got lighter. "Admiral." Her communications officer looked up from his station. "Ambassador Chen is requesting to speak with you." Chen, the decoy ambassador, left on the Galactic Station to maintain the illusion right up until the moment of extinction. One of the bravest and most tragic positions in the entire operation. "Patch her through." The main screen flickered, and Lyrian Chen's face appeared. She looked exhausted, lines of strain visible even through the interference of long-range transmission, but she was alive. The rescue team from Deep Fleet Omega had extracted her and her staff from collective custody within an hour of the attack beginning. "Admiral Okonkwo, I see the reports weren't exaggerated." "Ambassador, it's good to see you safe." Safe. Chen let out a breath that might have been a laugh in other circumstances. 3 months of imprisonment, Admiral. 3 months knowing that everything we'd worked for on the diplomatic front was for nothing. Knowing that if the Void Fleet failed, we'd be executed as war criminals. But we didn't fail. No, you didn't. Chen straightened. What happens now? The collective fleet is gone, but the Senate still has hundreds of member species, thousands of other fleets. They'll mobilize everything they have. Okonkwo nodded. I know. That's why we're not done yet. She gestured to her communications officer. Open a channel to the Galactic Senate. All frequencies. I want every species in this galaxy to hear what I'm about to say. The officer's hands moved across his console. Channel open, Admiral. You're broadcasting to every station, relay, and receiver in known space. Okonkwo stepped forward, letting the camera capture her fully. Behind her, through the viewport, the debris of the collective armada drifted in silent testimony to what humanity had become. This is Admiral Victoria Okonkwo of the Terran Void Collective, speaking to all species of the Galactic Senate. She paused, letting the words settle. 12 years ago, your governing body voted to exterminate the human race. Today, you witnessed the result of that decision. The Collective's extinction fleet has been destroyed. High Executor Thalvex is our prisoner. The Vorkith homeworld is currently surrounded by 600,000 Void Fleet vessels awaiting my orders. Across the galaxy, she knew, billions of beings were watching. Some with fear, some with disbelief, some, perhaps, with something approaching hope. For 300 years, we have prepared for this moment. We have built a civilization in the deep void, beyond your reach and your knowledge. We have developed technologies you cannot comprehend and cannot counter. We have become something more than the humans you thought you understood. She let the implications of that sink in. But we did not prepare for war. We prepared for survival. We prepared because you gave us no other choice. And now that we have survived, we must decide what kind of species we will become. Okonkwo's voice hardened. Here are our terms. The Galactic Senate is dissolved. The collective dominion is disbanded. The Vorkith caste that orchestrated humanity's planned extinction will stand trial for crimes against sentience. All species will be granted equal access to dimensional fold technology, freely shared and freely developed. No species will ever again be subjected to travel restrictions, trade sanctions, or territorial limitations designed to engineer their decline. She could imagine the chaos erupting across 1,000 worlds. The Vorkith had built their empire on control of movement, control of technology, control of information. She was dismantling the foundations of their power with every sentence. To those species who voted for our extinction, we will not seek vengeance. We are not interested in becoming what you tried to make us, but we will remember. We will be watching. And if any species ever again attempts to engineer the genocide of another, they will face the full power of the Void Fleet. To those species who stood with us, who voted against the Extinction Protocol, even knowing it might cost them dearly, we offer friendship, alliance, partnership in building a galaxy where no species must fear extermination simply for existing. And to the Vorketh specifically, your era of dominion is over. For 12,000 years you have ruled through fear and manipulation. You have crushed species you considered threats and exploited those you deemed useful. You convinced yourselves that you were the natural masters of this galaxy, that your age and your power gave you the right to decide who lived and who died. Okonkwo leaned forward. You were wrong. We are coming to your homeworld. Not to destroy it, we are not you, but to end your tyranny. Your military will be dismantled. Your leadership will be tried. Your species will learn what it means to exist as equals among equals, rather than masters above servants. She straightened. This is not a negotiation. This is not an offer. This is a statement of fact. Humanity has returned from the void, and we will never be caged again. The transmission ended. Okonkwo stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. 300 years of preparation. 4 billion lives sacrificed to maintain the illusion. Countless decisions made in the depths of the void, each one bringing them closer to this moment. Admiral, her tactical officer spoke softly, the fleet is awaiting orders. She turned from the viewport. Set course for the Vorkith homeworld. Full formation. I want them to see exactly what's coming for them. And the other collective species? Okonkwo considered. Begin dispatching diplomatic envoys. Real diplomatic envoys this time. We're offering them a choice. Join us in building something better or stand aside. I'd rather have allies than subjects. And if they resist? Then we'll do what we have to do. But I'm betting most of them won't. The Vorketh ruled through fear, and we just demonstrated that they're not the scariest thing in the galaxy anymore. She allowed herself a small, grim smile. Fear is a hell of a motivator. Let's make sure it works for us this time. Part 6. The Vorketh Surrender. The Vorketh homeworld was called Thexanar, and it had been the center of galactic civilization for longer than most species' recorded history. Its orbital rings housed shipyards that had built 10,000 dreadnoughts. Its surface cities were monuments to power and permanence. Its population had never known invasion, never known conquest, never known the fear of looking up and seeing enemy vessels in their sky. Until now. High Matriarch Velthona stood in the crystalline spire of the Supreme Council chamber, watching the darkness above her world fill with light. Not the light of stars, the light of engines. Hundreds of thousands of engines, attached to vessels larger and more numerous than anything the Vorketh had ever fielded. The Void Fleet had arrived. Your Eminence. Her military advisor approached on trembling legs. The human fleet has established complete orbital superiority. Our remaining defensive platforms have been neutralized. We have no means of resistance. Velthona said nothing. What was there to say? For 12,000 years, the Vorketh had shaped the galaxy according to their will. They had risen from their homeworld, conquered their system, developed dimensional fold technology, and spread across the stars like a wave of inevitability. Every species they encountered had either submitted or been destroyed. It was the natural order. It was how things had always been. And now, in the span of a single rotation, everything they'd built was ash. "The humans are hailing us," her communications officer reported. "They're they're demanding an immediate audience with the Supreme Council." Demanding. Velthona's voice was hollow. Yes, I suppose they would. She turned from the viewport. The other council members had gathered, 7 of them, the most powerful beings in the Vorketh hierarchy, now huddled together like frightened younglings. Velthona felt nothing but contempt for them. When the Extinction Protocol had been proposed, they had celebrated. They had congratulated themselves on finally solving the human problem. They had spoken of how easy it would be, how the primitive primates had been containable since first contact. Now, those primitive primates commanded a fleet that could crack their world like an egg, and the council could only tremble. "Accept the communication," Velthona ordered. "We will hear what the humans have to say." The central holographic projector flickered to life, and Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared before them. The human looked older than the historical records. 3 centuries older, Velthona reminded herself. But her eyes burned with the same cold fire that had characterized her final transmission. "High Matriarch Velthona," Okonkwo said, "I'm told you command what remains of the Vorketh government." "I do, though I suspect that won't be true for much longer." "That depends entirely on you." Okonkwo's image was joined by several others, human military officers, Velthona assumed, though their features were strange, somehow wrong, elongated, altered. 3 centuries in the deep void had changed them, she realized. They weren't quite human anymore. "We're prepared to offer terms," Okonkwo continued. "Better terms than you offered us, I might add. You were planning to erase our entire species from existence. We're not planning to do the same to you." Council member Tharavel pushed forward, his crest flaring with indignation despite everything. "You dare to threaten us? The Vorketh have ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years, yes, you mentioned that,"
Multiple times, in every speech and declaration and condescending lecture you delivered while plotting our genocide. Okonkwo's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a blade nonetheless. Let me be very clear about something. Your history doesn't impress me. Your power doesn't frighten me. Your civilization is old and vast and currently completely helpless before my fleet.
She paused.
But I'm not here to destroy you. Despite what you tried to do to us, despite everything, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to offer you a choice.
Velthona stepped forward. What choice?
Surrender unconditionally. Disband your military. Submit your leadership, including this council, to trial for the crimes committed against humanity and other species you've subjugated over the millennia. Accept a transitional government under void collective oversight until your society can be reformed into something compatible with the new galactic order we're creating.
And if we refuse?
Okonkwo's expression didn't change. Then we begin orbital bombardment in 6 hours. We destroy your shipyards, your military installations, your governmental infrastructure. We reduce your capability to wage war to 0, with all the civilian casualties that implies. And then we occupy your world by force and impose those same conditions anyway, except you won't be alive to see them. The council chamber fell silent. Velthona understood. The humans weren't bluffing. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to be turned aside by threats or negotiations. They would do exactly what they promised, and the Vorketh had no means to stop them. But there was something else in Okonkwo's words, something beyond the cold calculus of military force. You said you're creating a new galactic order, Velthona said slowly. What does that mean? It means exactly what I broadcast to the Senate. Equal access to fold technology. No more travel restrictions. No more territorial constraints designed to strangle developing species. No more extinction protocols for races that don't fit your preferred mold. Okonkwo's voice softened slightly. Not with mercy exactly, but with something approaching understanding. We're not trying to replace the Vorketh as galactic overlords, matriarch. We're trying to ensure that no species ever has that kind of power over others again. Including yourselves? Including ourselves, Okonkwo nodded. The Void Collective will maintain military superiority for the foreseeable future. That's a practical necessity. But we're not interested in ruling the galaxy. We're interested in making sure no one else can rule it either. Velthona turned to look at her fellow council members. They were broken, she saw. Whatever pride or defiance they might have mustered had crumbled in the face of reality. They would agree to anything, surrender anything, just to survive. Perhaps that was fitting. The Vorketh had built their empire on the submission of others. Now they would learn what submission felt like. We accept, Velthona said. We surrender unconditionally, as you have demanded. Good. Okonkwo's expression remained unchanged. My ground forces will secure your capital within the hour. You and your council will be taken into custody pending trial. Cooperate, and this transition will proceed with minimal loss of life. Resist, and... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The communication ended. Velthona stood in the silence that followed, watching through the viewport as the human fleet began its descent toward Thexanar. 12,000 years of dominion ended in a single day by a species they dismissed as primitive. How had they been so wrong? But she knew the answer. They judged humanity by Vorketh standards, by the cautious, conservative, millennia-long development that their own species had followed. They'd assumed that humans, like every other species they'd encountered, could be contained and controlled through the familiar mechanisms of trade restrictions and territorial limits. They'd never imagined that a species would be desperate enough, determined enough, to flee into the depths of the void itself, to sacrifice billions of their own people as decoys, to spend centuries building a civilization hidden from all observation. The Vorketh had underestimated human stubbornness, and now they would pay the price. Part 7. The Trials. The trials lasted for 3 years. They were held on a purpose-built station in the neutral space between former collective territory and the expanding sphere of void collective influence, a location chosen specifically to emphasize that this was not human vengeance, but galactic justice. Representatives from 400 species served on the judicial panel. Evidence was presented from thousands of sources, recovered communications, historical archives, testimony from survivors of Vorketh subjugation across the millennia. The scope of the crimes revealed was staggering. 17 species had been driven to extinction under Vorketh rule, their worlds sterilized and their people erased from history. Dozens more had been deliberately crippled, their development stunted through trade restrictions and technological suppression, their populations reduced to servitude. The Vorketh had built their empire not just on conquest, but on the systematic destruction of any species that might one day challenge their supremacy. Humanity had simply been the latest target. If the Extinction Protocol had succeeded, they would have been the 18th species to disappear from the galaxy. Instead, they had become the instrument of justice. High Matriarch Velthona testified for 6 weeks. She admitted to everything: the centuries of planning, the manipulation of the Galactic Senate, the deliberate campaign to isolate and weaken humanity before the final strike. She did not apologize. The Vorketh did not believe in apologies. But she acknowledged the reality of what her species had done, and she accepted the judgment of the tribunal. The sentences varied. Some Vorketh leaders were executed, those directly responsible for ordering the extinction strikes that had killed 4 billion humans on the colony worlds. Others received life imprisonment. The majority were released to their homeworld under strict monitoring conditions, their military capabilities permanently restricted, their role in galactic affairs reduced to that of any other species. Velthona herself was sentenced to execution. She accepted the verdict with the same cold dignity she had maintained throughout the trial. "We made a mistake," she said in her final statement. "We believed that age conveyed wisdom, that power conveyed right, that our 12,000 years of dominion made us the natural rulers of this galaxy. We were wrong. The humans have taught us what we should have learned millennia ago, that no species is inherently superior to any other, and that those who believe otherwise will eventually face a reckoning." She paused, her ancient eyes sweeping across the assembled representatives of 400 worlds. "I hope you learn from our example. I hope you build something better than what we created. And I hope, for your sake, that you never give the Void Collective a reason to remind you of what they're capable of." She was executed the following morning. The Vorketh era was officially over. In the decades that followed, the galaxy transformed. The Galactic Senate was replaced by the Galactic Assembly, a genuinely representative body, where every species had an equal voice, regardless of their age or power. Dimensional fold technology was freely distributed, ending the Vorketh monopoly on interstellar travel. Trade flourished without artificial restrictions. Species that had been suppressed for millennia suddenly had access to resources and opportunities that had been denied them. It wasn't a utopia. The galaxy was too vast, too complex, too filled with competing interests for any single order to create perfect harmony. Conflicts arose. Disputes escalated. Some species resented the Void Collective's military dominance even as they benefited from the new order it enforced. But the fundamental dynamic had changed. No longer was galactic society organized around the interests of a single dominant species. No longer did the strong exist to prey upon the weak. The Void Collective's fleet remained the ultimate guarantor of the new order, but it was used sparingly, carefully, only when other mechanisms failed. Admiral Okonkwo did not live to see most of this. Even with the life extension technologies developed in the deep void, she was ancient by human standards, nearly 4 centuries old, and the strain of command had taken its toll. She retired from active service 20 years after the Vorkith surrender, spending her remaining days in a quiet estate on one of the colony worlds that had been rebuilt after the Extinction strikes. She died peacefully, surrounded by family and friends, mourned across 1,000 worlds. Her successor, Admiral Chen Wei, born in the deep void, raised on stories of the species' darkest hour and greatest triumph, maintained her policies faithfully. The Void Collective would protect the weak. It would punish aggression. It would never again allow a single species to dominate the galaxy. And it would never forget what humanity had endured to reach this point. Part 9. Legacy. 100 years after the Battle of Sol, a monument was unveiled in orbit around Earth. It was called the Wall of Names, and it stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the void, a crystalline lattice inscribed with 4 billion names. One for every human who had died on the colony worlds. One for every soul that had been sacrificed to maintain the deception that had allowed the Void Fleet to prepare in secret. The unveiling ceremony was attended by representatives from across the galaxy, including, controversially, a delegation from the reformed Vorkith Society. Many humans had objected to their presence. 4 billion deaths still burned in living memory. But Admiral Chen Wei had overruled the objections. "We are not what they tried to make us," she said. "We will not become a species that nurtures hatred across generations. The Vorkith who committed those crimes are dead. The Vorkith who exist today are not responsible for the sins of their ancestors. If we truly believe in the order we've created, we must extend its principles even to those we have every reason to despise." The Vorkith ambassador, a young female named Thelvera, born decades after the war, approached the Wall of Names with a single flower from her homeworld. It was a small gesture, almost pathetically inadequate to the scale of the tragedy it acknowledged. But she laid it at the base of the monument with genuine reverence, and she spoke words that her ancestors would never have been capable of uttering. "We remember what was done in our name. We carry the weight of our history, not to repeat it, but to ensure it is never repeated. To the 4 billion humans who died because of Vorketh arrogance, we offer the only thing we can, the promise that your sacrifice will not be forgotten, and the vow that we will work every day to build a galaxy worthy of your memory." Many humans wept at her words, some in grief, some in anger, but some, a few, wept with something approaching forgiveness. Not all wounds could heal, not all sins could be absolved, but perhaps, across enough generations, even the deepest hatreds could fade into something like understanding. That was the hope, at least. The hope that humanity's darkest hour had given birth to a brighter galaxy. Part 10. The Deep Remembers. In the depths of the void,
in that strange dimension between dimensions, where time moved differently and physics bent to human will, the old cities still stood. 300 years of construction had created a civilization there, massive habitation spheres, industrial complexes that dwarfed anything in normal space, research facilities where technologies that would seem like magic to other species were developed and refined. The deep void had been humanity's refuge, their fortress, their birthplace as a truly spacefaring species. And even now, a century after their emergence, many humans still called it home. They were different from their surface cousins, taller, paler, adapted to the strange radiations and pressures of their adopted dimension. 3 centuries of evolution, both natural and guided, had created a subspecies that some barely recognized as human at all. But they remembered. Oh, they remembered. In the deepest archives of the deep void, in vaults sealed against everything that time and entropy could throw at them, the records were preserved. Every treaty that had been broken, every sanction that had been imposed, every speech where Vorkith leaders had spoken of humanity as vermin to be exterminated. And alongside those records, something else. The names of every human who had volunteered to remain in normal space, knowing they were being left as decoys. Knowing that when the extinction fleet came, they would die. Knowing that their sacrifice was necessary to maintain the illusion that allowed the Void Fleet to prepare. 4 billion names. Not just victims, volunteers. Every one of them had known the plan. Every one of them had chosen to stay, to live and love and build and die, all so that their hidden kin could grow strong enough to save the species. The deep humans told their children these stories. They taught them that freedom was never free, that survival sometimes required unimaginable sacrifice, that humanity's strength came not from technology or numbers, but from an unbreakable determination to endure. And they taught them to be ready, because the galaxy was vast, and there were threats beyond the Vorkith, ancient intelligences slumbering in dark nebulae, species that had achieved terrifying capabilities without ever developing empathy, forces that even the Void Fleet, for all its power, might struggle to contain. The universe was full of wonders and horrors in equal measure. Humanity had survived the first great test. There would be others. But the deep humans were patient. They continued to build, to research, to prepare. They watched the galaxy through sensors that spanned dimensions, tracking threats before they could develop, positioning forces where they might be needed. And sometimes, when they looked out from their habitation spheres into the endless depth of their adopted dimension, they allowed themselves a moment of pride. They had been threatened with extinction. They had been dismissed as primitives. They had been given a choice between submission and annihilation. They had chosen a third option. They had found a way. They had survived. And now, spread across normal space and the deep void alike, they would never be caged again. Epilogue. The Watcher. The Kathrani ambassador, Zelvith, had lived for 217 standard years. She had seen the height of Vorketh power and its sudden, catastrophic fall. She had watched humanity emerge from the void like an avenging god and reshape the galaxy in a single generation. Now, ancient beyond the normal span of her species, she sat in her chambers on the Galactic Assembly Station and waited for her final visitor. The human who entered was young by her standards, perhaps 40 standard years, but his eyes held a weight that suggested much longer experience. He was void-born, she could tell. The subtle differences in his features marked him as a child of the deep. "Ambassador Zelvith," he said, bowing in the Kathrani fashion, "I'm honored to meet you.
The archives speak highly of your courage during the crisis.
The archives are kind.
Zelvith's sensory fronds waved in what passed for a smile among her people. I did only what any being with a conscience should have done. I voted against the Extinction Protocol. One of only 451 who did so, out of 1,700 species. Most were afraid. Zelvith settled deeper into her support frame. The Vorketh had been dominant for so long that many species couldn't imagine defying them. And humans were unknown, unpredictable. There were legitimate reasons to be wary.
But not reasons to commit genocide.
No, never that. Zelvith was quiet for a moment. Why have you come to see me, young one? I am dying. There is little wisdom I can offer that your people don't already possess. The human smiled, a gentle expression, surprisingly warm for one of his altered kind. We don't possess wisdom, Ambassador. We possess experience, sometimes traumatic experience. Wisdom has to be earned in a different way. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I came to thank you, personally, for what you did a century ago. I did nothing. Your people saved themselves. You did more than nothing. When the extinction fleet was announced, when every other species was either celebrating or looking away, you watched, you grieved. And when our ambassador was taken into custody, you made sure she was treated fairly, even though you risked retaliation. Zelvith's fronds shifted in surprise. You know about that? We know about everything, Ambassador. Our archives are very comprehensive. The human's smile faded slightly. Ambassador Chen survived because of you. She told stories about the Kethrani delegate who smuggled her extra food, who argued for better conditions, who treated human prisoners like people even when it was dangerous to do so. It was the least I could do. It was everything. In those dark days, when we were building our fleet in the deep void, we debated constantly about what kind of species we would become. Would we emerge as conquerors, seeking vengeance? Would we burn the galaxy to ashes in retaliation for what had been done to us? He leaned forward. Stories like yours reminded us that not everyone had abandoned us, that there were beings in the galaxy worth saving, that when we emerged, we should build something better, not just something stronger. Zelvith felt warmth spreading through her aged body, a sensation she hadn't experienced in decades. I am glad. I always hoped. I always feared that humans would become what the Vorketh were, that your suffering would make you cruel. It nearly did. The human's voice was soft. 3 centuries of preparing for war. 4 billion of our people sacrificed as decoys. We had every justification for cruelty, every reason to become monsters. But you didn't. No, because we remembered that there were beings like you, beings who did what was right even when it cost them, beings who proved that the galaxy was worth saving, not just conquering. He stood. The Kethrani Federation will never want for anything, Ambassador. Your people will have priority access to every technology we develop, every resource we control. Not because we feel we owe you, though we do, but because you showed us what sentient beings should be. Because you represented what we were fighting for. Zelvith's fronds waved in the Kethrani equivalent of tears. You honor me. You honor my people. We honor everyone who deserves it. That's the lesson we learned, Ambassador. That's what 3 centuries in the void taught us. He moved toward the door, then paused. One last thing. The deep void scientists have been working on life extension technologies. We can't reverse aging, not entirely, but we can slow it, grant additional decades, sometimes centuries.
Zelvith's hearts quickened. You would offer this to me?
To all Kethrani who wish it, but to you specifically. We thought you might want to see what we build next. The galaxy is changing, Ambassador, changing faster than it has in millennia, and we'd like you there to watch.
For a long moment, Zelvith was silent. Then she unfolded from her support frame, rising on trembling legs to face the human.
I have lived long enough, she said quietly. I have seen the fall of tyranny and the rise of hope. I have witnessed horrors and wonders alike. What more could I possibly need to see? Peace, the human said simply. True peace. Not the false stability that the Vorkith imposed, but genuine cooperation between species. A galaxy where no one fears extinction, where children grow up believing they have a future. Can such a thing exist? We don't know. That's the point. We're building it as we go, making it up as we move forward, hoping that we're wise enough to avoid our predecessors' mistakes. He smiled again. We could use someone like you to keep us honest. Someone who saw what the old order was like, who can remind us why we fought to change it. Zelvith looked at the human, this strange being from the depths of space, this child of a species that should have been extinct, and made her decision. Very well, she said. I will accept your gift. I will watch and remember and hope.
That's all we ask, Ambassador. That's all any of us can do.
He left. Zelvith stood in the silence that followed, looking out at the stars that spread across her viewport. Somewhere out there, the Void Fleet patrolled the darkness. Somewhere, the deep void harbors still hummed with construction. Somewhere, the descendants of 4 billion martyrs built new lives on rebuilt worlds. Humanity had returned from the void, and the galaxy would never be the same. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would be better. That was the hope that had sustained beings like Zelvith through the darkest times. The hope that sentient creatures could learn from their mistakes. The hope that cruelty and tyranny and genocide were not inevitable. That each generation could choose to be better than the last. It was a fragile hope. History offered countless examples of its failure. But it was the only hope that mattered in the end. And thanks to a species that had refused to accept extinction, that hope still burned. Bright and fierce and eternal. Just like humanity itself. The end.